When you're a university student scraping by, you'll take just about any job that promises a paycheck, even if it comes with the creepy title of night shift care assistant at the local mental hospital. It's the sort of job you hear about from that one friend who always has a lead on the weirdest gigs. And there I was, 2 days after applying, standing in front of Glenridge Psychiatric Hospital, more excited about the cash than worried about what I'd signed up for. Little did I know, I'd soon wish I had opted for flipping burgers instead. The first night started off deceptively normal. The place was old, with long, winding hallways lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, the kind that feels like it's trying too hard to cover something else up. My job seemed straightforward: monitor the patients, respond to emergencies, and make sure nobody escaped or caused harm to themselves or others. Simple, right? Well, that was before I met the patients and the, residents that didn't exactly show up on the roster. The first unsettling experience happened around midnight on my third shift. I was doing rounds, walking through one of the more secluded wings that housed the long-term patients, those who had been there for years, forgotten by time and, probably, by everyone who once cared for them. I was halfway down the hallway when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter. It echoed through the corridor, clear as day. Now, unless Glenridge was running a very questionable daycare, there shouldn't have been any children around. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me, too many late-night horror movies, right? But then, I saw her. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing at the end of the hall, staring straight at me. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white dress. I blinked, and she was gone. No doors opened, no footsteps echoed, just gone. I tried to tell myself I was seeing things, that maybe one of the elderly patients had wandered out and my mind filled in the gaps. But that didn't explain the laughter, or why I suddenly felt so cold. By the end of my first week, I was questioning every life decision that had led me to that point. But the cash was decent, and my pride wouldn't let me quit. Yet, every night, the hospital seemed to reveal a new layer of its twisted personality. There was Mr. Thompson, an older man in his 60s, who insisted that his wife visited him every night. He'd talk to her for hours, smiling and laughing as if she was really there. The nurses told me his wife had died over a decade ago, but every night, he'd sit in the common area, chatting away with someone only he could see. One night, I asked him what she looked like, trying to keep the conversation light. He turned to me with the most serious expression I'd ever seen and said, "She's right behind you. Would you like to meet her?" I didn't look. You couldn't have paid me enough to turn around. Then there was the case of Sally, a middle-aged woman who was almost catatonic during the day. Come nightfall, though, she'd become extremely active, often standing in the corner of her room, facing the wall, muttering things under her breath. One night, as I was doing rounds, she stopped muttering as soon as I entered her room. She slowly turned around and, with eyes that didn't seem like her own, whispered, "He's waiting for you in the basement." I laughed nervously, the kind of laugh you let out when you're more scared than you want to admit, but something about the way she said it, the conviction in her voice, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The problem was, there was no basement. At least, not according to the blueprints and everything I'd been told during orientation. But the way she spoke, it made me wonder if there was something else, something older, deeper, hidden beneath the hospital. I wasn't brave enough to find out. 3 weeks in, and I was ready to swear off night shifts forever. Each night felt longer and darker than the last, stretching into what felt like years. The patients weren't the only ones losing touch with reality. I felt like I was, too. Every creak, every whisper in the wind felt like it was aimed directly at me, a personal message from the hospital itself, telling me that I was in over my head. One night, I was asked to watch over a new patient who'd been admitted earlier that evening. The man was in his late 30s, but his eyes looked much older, hollowed out and haunted. The staff said he was found wandering the streets, claiming he'd seen it. When I asked what it was, no one had an answer, and the patient hadn't spoken a word since his arrival. During my shift, the man suddenly sat up in bed, eyes wide open, and started screaming, this guttural, primal sound that didn't seem human. The lights in the room flickered, and just for a moment, I swear I saw a shadow, something huge and unnatural, standing behind him. It felt like the room itself was closing in on me, like something was watching from every corner. I froze, my feet glued to the floor, until another nurse ran in and sedated him. As the drugs took effect, the man grabbed my arm and, with a strength I didn't think possible in his state, whispered, "Don't let it see you. Don't let it see your fear." That was it for me. That very night, I typed up my resignation letter. I didn't care about the money anymore. Hell, I didn't even care if I had to live off ramen for the rest of the semester. I wasn't going to spend another minute in that place. As I left the hospital for the last time, I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. I didn't look back. I still have nightmares sometimes, flashes of that hospital, the little girl, the shadow behind the screaming man. But I'm getting through it, one day at a time. If there's one thing I've learned from that experience, it's that I'm definitely not cut out for a career in healthcare. After graduation, I'll stick to something safe, like accounting. Numbers don't laugh at you in the middle of the night, after all. So here's to hoping I land a good job after graduation, because let me tell you, there is no way I'm stepping foot in another care facility again. It's not worth it losing my mind over some minimum wage. Trust me on that one. If you know a carer, please, give them a hug because what my eyes have seen, my mouth cannot say it all. I've worked as a night carer at Evergreen Manor for 3 years now, and I've seen more people pass away than I can count. It's part of the job, something you come to terms with when you work in a place like this. But let me tell you about Mrs. Thatcher, the woman who made me question everything about this job. Mrs. Thatcher was in her late 90s, though you'd think she was 150 by the way she acted. A tiny, frail thing with skin as thin as parchment, she had the grip of a gorilla and a temper that could curdle milk. She was never satisfied, not with any of us caregivers. You could give her a 5-star treatment, and she'd still look at you like you were feeding her scraps off the floor. During personal care, she'd scratch at my arms with those bony fingers of hers, like she was trying to peel my skin off. And the cursing. My God, she had a mouth on her. I don't know where she picked up half those words, but she'd scream them at you in a voice that was more gravel than human. And don't get me started on the hair pulling. I made the mistake of leaning in too close once while helping her with her dentures, and she grabbed a fistful of my hair and yanked so hard I thought she was going to take my scalp with her. I had to pry her off me, all while she was shouting something about how the devil himself couldn't make her eat that slop we called dinner. You might think I'm exaggerating, but anyone who worked the day shift will tell you the same. Mrs. Thatcher was a terror. We tried to be patient, to understand that maybe she was just scared or in pain. But some days, it felt like she was just plain mean. Like she got some twisted joy out of making our lives miserable. I used to joke with the others that if Mrs. Thatcher ever passed away, the devil himself would be too scared to take her. Then, one day, she did pass. It was around 6 p.m., right at the end of the day shift. I wasn't there when it happened, but the girls who were said it was peaceful enough. She just slipped away in her sleep, no fanfare, no last-minute curses. I remember walking into her room that night for my shift, expecting some kind of eerie silence, but it just felt like any other empty room. I even felt a little guilty for the sense of relief I had knowing I wouldn't have to deal with her anymore. Well, that relief didn't last long. My night started like any other. I made my rounds, checking in on the residents, making sure everyone was settled. Mrs. Thatcher's room was dark, the bed already stripped. The cleaners had done their job, and the room felt cold, empty, like she'd never been there at all. I remember pausing at the door, half expecting to hear her rasping voice telling me to get lost, but all I heard was the hum of the air conditioner. It was around midnight when things got weird. I was sitting at the nurse's station, minding my own business, when I heard it, the sound of shuffling footsteps down the hallway. I looked up, thinking maybe one of the residents was up and wandering around, but the hallway was empty. The sound grew louder, closer, like someone was dragging their feet along the floor. I stood up, peering into the shadows, but there was nothing. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped, right in front of Mrs. Thatcher's old room. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I forced myself to walk down the hall and check it out. I had to, it was my job, after all. When I got to the door, it was closed, just like I'd left it. I took a deep breath and opened it, half expecting to see her sitting there on the bed, glaring at me. But the room was empty, silent. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling a little silly for getting spooked. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, this faint, scratching sound. It was coming from the walls, like nails dragging slowly across the plaster. My heart started pounding, and I whipped around, shining my flashlight all over the place, but there was nothing there. The sound stopped, and the room was dead quiet again. I backed out of there so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. Back at the nurse's station, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just the building settling, old pipes making noise, anything logical. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Around 3 a.m., I was making my rounds again when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Thatcher's old room, it wasn't just closed, it was locked. Now, I know I didn't lock it. I hadn't even touched the door after I left the first time. But there it was, locked tight, the key missing from the ring on my belt. At this point, I was seriously freaking out. I ran to get the spare key from the office, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. When I finally unlocked it and pushed the door open, I almost screamed. There, on the bed, was the impression of a body, like someone had just been lying there. The sheets were crumpled, the pillow slightly dented, as if someone had just gotten up. And the air, it was freezing cold, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in just that room. I was about to back out of the room, when I felt it, this sharp, burning pain on my arm. I looked down to see red scratch marks, fresh, like someone had clawed at me. But there was no one there. That's when I heard it, clear as day, a voice, her voice, right in my ear. "Didn't I tell you, girl? I'm not going anywhere." I ran out of there so fast I nearly knocked over a couple of chairs in the hallway. I didn't stop until I was outside, gulping in the warm night air, trying to make sense of what just happened. But there was no making sense of it. Mrs. Thatcher was gone, but somehow, she wasn't. The rest of the night, I stayed in the break room, refusing to go anywhere near her old room. I could still feel the scratches on my arm, stinging like a fresh burn, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice, that raspy, awful voice telling me she wasn't finished with me yet. By the time morning came, I was done. I walked right into my supervisor's office and handed in my notice. No way was I staying another night in that place. So, if you know a carer, please, give them a hug. You never know what they're dealing with. As for me, I'm sticking to day shifts from now on. I'd rather deal with a grumpy old lady in the daylight than face whatever the hell Mrs. Thatcher has become in the dark. When I got the job at St. Martin's Hospital, I figured it was just another paycheck. After months of scraping by, a night shift as a security guard sounded easy enough. I didn't buy into all that paranormal nonsense people always talked about when they mentioned New Orleans, anyway. Ghosts were for tourists, not for someone like me. St. Martin's was old, really old. The original wing dated back to the early 1900s, and over the years, they'd added new sections, so the place was a labyrinth of hallways and staircases. My supervisor, Greg, an older guy who looked like he'd seen it all, gave me the rundown on my first night. "This is the West Wing," he said, his voice gruff. "Not much happening here at night. Storage rooms, mostly. That elevator at the end, don't use it. It's been stuck on the 6th floor for a year. I nodded, pretending to care. It was just a job. I wasn't planning to get involved in any of the hospital's drama. We passed the chapel, its heavy wooden doors closed tight. Greg paused, glancing at them for a second longer than necessary. People say they hear things around here, he said. But remember, it's an old building. Creaks, groans, nothing more. I just nodded again, thinking he was trying to mess with the new guy. Ghost stories? Yeah, right. The first night was uneventful, which suited me just fine. I walked the rounds, checked the security cameras, and spent the rest of the time scrolling through my phone. Easy money, I thought. But the second night, things got weird. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it, a grinding, metallic sound echoing down the hallway in the west wing. I knew immediately where it was coming from, that old elevator Greg had mentioned. The one that was supposedly stuck on the 6th floor. Curiosity got the better of me, and I headed over to check it out. The elevator doors were slightly open, and as I peeked inside, my heart skipped a beat. There, in the corner, was a dark figure, just standing there. I couldn't see a face, but I felt it looking right at me. Before I could do anything, the doors slammed shut, and the elevator rumbled, heading down to the basement. I backed away, pulling out my radio to call Greg. Greg? I thought you said that elevator was stuck. It just went down to the basement. And I think, someone was in it. Greg's voice crackled back, casual as ever. No one's down there, kid. You're probably just seeing things. This building plays tricks on you at night. Seeing things? I wasn't sure, but I decided to avoid the West Wing for the rest of my shift. By the third night, I was starting to feel uneasy. St. Martin's wasn't just an old building, it was like a maze of bad vibes. Everything about it felt off. And then there was the chapel. It was just after 3 a.m. when I heard the bells. At first, it was faint, so faint I thought I was imagining it. But the sound grew louder, clearer. Bells, tolling away in the dead of night. I knew for a fact those bells hadn't worked in decades, Greg had mentioned it offhand during the tour. Yet there they were, ringing like it was Sunday morning. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to check it out. I pushed open the heavy chapel doors and stepped inside. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The bells had stopped, replaced by a low, droning hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. As I scanned the room, my flashlight caught something that made me freeze. In the front pew sat a woman, her head bowed in prayer. She was wearing an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, the kind you see in those black and white photos from 100 years ago. "Ma'am?" I called out, my voice shaking. She didn't move at first, but then, slowly, she lifted her head. When she looked at me, I felt my blood turn to ice. Her eyes, they were hollow, empty, like she was staring right through me. I staggered back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The woman just sat there, her gaze following me as I backed out of the chapel and slammed the doors shut behind me. I was shaking so bad I could barely get my radio out. "Greg, I just saw something in the chapel." "A woman. She's not, right?" Greg sighed on the other end, sounding annoyed. "Ethan, I don't know what you think you saw, but you need to calm down. This place will mess with your head if you let it." I didn't sleep that day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those hollow eyes staring back at me. By the fourth night, I knew I had to get some answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that this place was getting to me. After a few hours of walking the same old rounds, I found Greg in the security office, drinking his coffee like it was any other night. "Greg, I need to know what's going on in this place," I said, not even bothering to hide the fear in my voice. "I've seen things. The elevator, the chapel, and now I keep hearing footsteps behind me, but when I turn around, there's no one there. Greg looked at me, those tired eyes of his giving nothing away. You really want to know? Yeah, I do, I said, crossing my arms. I wasn't leaving without an explanation. He set his coffee down and sighed, leaning back in his chair. There are stories, all right. Everyone who works here has had their run-ins. That woman you saw in the chapel. That's probably Nurse Evelyn. She was a nurse during the flu epidemic in 1918. Lost so many patients, she started going mad. One night, she hung herself in the chapel, hoping to find peace. But she didn't. People still see her, especially on the night shift. I felt a chill run down my spine. And the elevator? Greg hesitated. That's from the fire in '62. A patient was trapped on the 6th floor. The whole wing went up in flames, and she didn't make it. Sometimes, the elevator still tries to go there, like it's searching for her. I swallowed hard. Why didn't you tell me any of this before? Greg shrugged. Would you have taken the job if I had? By the 5th night, I was a wreck. Every shadow made me jump, every creak set my nerves on edge. I was determined to get through the shift, but deep down, I knew I couldn't keep doing this. Around 3:30 a.m., I was down in the basement, checking the boiler room, when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. I spun around, my flashlight darting through the hallway. No one. But the footsteps continued, louder now, circling me, closing in. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps. I did what any sane person would do, I ran. My footsteps echoed wildly as I sprinted down the corridor, heading for the stairwell. But when I reached it, I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing at the top of the stairs was the woman from the chapel. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and she raised a hand, pointing behind me. I didn't want to turn around, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I looked over my shoulder and saw it, the shadowy figure from the elevator, its face now clear. It was charred, twisted, a mask of pain and terror. I lost it. I shoved past the ghostly woman and bolted up the stairs, not stopping until I burst out of the hospital's main entrance into the humid New Orleans night. The next morning, I went back to St. Martin's one last time, only to drop off my resignation. Greg was waiting for me, that same knowing look in his eyes. Couldn't handle it, huh? I shook my head, still trembling. No job is worth losing my sanity. I don't know how you've done this for so long. Greg just smiled, a little sadly. Some of us get used to it. Some of us, never do. Good luck, kid. And don't be surprised if you see St. Martin's in your dreams for a while. I left without looking back, vowing never to set foot in another hospital again. But Greg was right. St. Martin's followed me, haunting my dreams with echoes of tolling bells, phantom footsteps, and the hollow eyes of a woman who would never find peace. Thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. Your time and engagement mean the world to me. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. And be sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support keeps this channel going, and I truly appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you.